Well, everyone, I've seen so many people do this, and I want to do it myself. We're going to go ahead and compare the iPhone 14 against really every other iPhone that's been, created. Now, I have the base models of all these. I was consider the iPhone 14 the base model, so I didn't really grab my pluses, my Pro Maxes, or anything. But I wanted to start off from the beginning with something like the iPhone 2G. This was the very first iPhone that ever came out, and this wasn't actually the iPhone, it was the iPhone 1, but they call it 2G because, it was an iPhone that had 2G. And to see how far we've came in pretty much how many years, 2007 this phone came out, so you can do the math, how many years later we've gotten such a crazy great upgrade. I will say the iPhone 10 was probably the biggest change, but between these two, I mean, the thickness, I just want to show you the thickness. This is the craziest thing. Look at the size, how much bigger the iPhone 14 is compared to the iPhone. This was the only iPhone at that time, and this was supposed to be like a big phone at that time too. So you can kind of see if we go and zoom in, the thinness and thickness. I mean, I think the iPhone 14 is actually a thinner phone than the iPhone 2G, which is actually pretty crazy. If you look on the back, I mean, you can also tell as well. I mean, just look at how crazy that is, how much better of a camera setup and how much more improvements we've made since that point. The Apple logo on the back is probably the size of the camera now, which is insane. So I will tell you from that phone, one of the other phones that I've used quite a bit was the iPhone 3G. And I didn't grab my 3GS, but this was actually the first iPhone that I actually ever bought. With something like the iPhone 3GS and the 3G, and this was, I would say, a pretty big upgrade coming from the iPhone, 2G. So in these two models, you can see obviously there's a really big difference. We still have the 30-pin connector, but on the back, we kind of got this new glossy kind of back with this little curved side that's much more curved out than the back of the iPhone 2G. So I'll tell you, although the rest of the phone not that crazy big of a difference, this was honestly a pretty big difference at that time. But then we get into probably one of my favorite phones of all time and one of the most impactful iPhones, which are the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 4S. So still at this moment, we got, obviously a very similar design to the 2G on the front, but this time we got a Retina display. This was a higher resolution display than what we were getting before. I do wish these phones charged up before. I put them on charge, I don't know why they died already. But this was also the first time that we got a flat side on the iPhone 4. So 4, 4S, and pretty much most iPhones after that, not the 6, but most iPhones after that, we started getting these flat sides. And this is where things are starting to actually kind of look more similar to where we are nowadays. Now you can kind of see again how much smaller this phone is compared to the iPhone 14, but just look at the similarity. This phone came out in 2010 and the 2011 with the iPhone 4S. Look at how similar that design is. If we take a look at the back, this was also the first time we saw glass bags on the iPhone in general as well. So this was, in my opinion, probably the most impactful phone Apple has ever made. And when I look at basically all the other iPhones Apple has made since then, it is actually pretty insane to me that Apple, created this good of a device back then. Now also with this side, we got the power button up top. I do wish Apple brought the power button back up top. I think that'd be kind of cool. And on the bottom, honestly, I didn't even take a look at this, but look how similar the bottoms are. I mean, we have the, still the same charging port and still the speaker set on the side, and even the screws are in the same place pretty much. I think it's pretty insane what Apple pretty much did at this point. And then we also got another pretty big upgrade with the iPhone 5 in 2012. I think personally the iPhone 5 was a pretty big upgrade as well, and it was a big upgrade, but it was also a downgrade. Apple removed the full glass back. They brought two like glass shards on the top and the bottom, but I wish Apple kind of brought that in. We also got a pretty big, I would say a pretty decent jump in performance. We had a 1 GB of RAM on this phone. We had the chipset, the A7 chipset inside of this thing, which really wasn't super outdated. We had the A6 chipset inside of this thing, which wasn't really that bad. And this thing got iOS 10, and I do think this was one of the more stabilized phones for a period of time when iOS 11 came out. Now, on top of that, another massive thing the iPhone 5 brought was actually with its front screen. This was the first time since the first iPhone that we got a bigger display. We got a 4-inch display on the iPhone 5 than the iPhone 14. So that was another massive difference. And then we got the iPhone 5S, which honestly is also very similar to something like the iPhone 5. We had, the same type of design, but I would say most of the big changes was actually with the Touch ID. This was a new technology with the front-facing camera, and that was honestly a pretty big difference. We also got, I would say, better cameras, but this was a long-lasting phone back in 2013 when this phone came out. But then in 2014, we got one of the biggest changes ever. We finally got a bigger sized phone than the standard iPhones that we were getting at that time. This was the iPhones, and these came in two different models. We had the iPhone 6 and we also had the iPhone 6 Plus. Now with this iPhone, we had a 4.7-inch display, and the iPhone 6 Plus, we had a 5.5-inch display. And I will definitely tell you, these iPhones were honestly quite a bit different as well from the predecessors. And it's almost like the iPhone 14. I mean, for so many years, we had like back to back to back to back changes with massive changes. And now with the iPhone 14, that's not really the same case. So we are still getting bigger displays here, except for the 5.5-inch on the 6 Plus. This was a pretty big design change, I would say, and we no longer had the flat sides. But it's funny because this was the first time we got rid of the flat sides, and Apple ended up bringing them back, with the iPhone 12. And then with the iPhone 6s, one of my favorite iPhones ever made that came out in 2015, this pretty much fixed everything that was wrong with the iPhone 6, and this is how Apple should have dropped the iPhone 6 in the first place. We had twice the amount of RAM on the iPhone 6s compared to the iPhone 6, so that in and of itself was a pretty big change. Very similar to the iPhone 14 because this iPhone brought 2 gigabytes of RAM more than the iPhone, 13. So that's another big deal, I would say, for the base model iPhones. And I'll say same Touch ID, same everything. It was a really big change at that moment as well. Then we got the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, which in my opinion, the 7 Plus are very good iPhones. These ones just got discontinued, and this was another massive change, I would say, for the most part, because Apple got rid of the headphone jack. Very similar to how Apple got rid of the SIM card tray now. We no longer had a headphone jack on the iPhone 7, so that was another big change in this phone. And this phone actually just got discontinued with software as well, which is kind of unfortunate. Then with the iPhone 8, very much more of the same. We had, glass back, finally back on the iPhone. And, this phone is still supported with software. It's the lowest iPhone on iOS 16. I do feel like Apple could have done a little bit of a better job with the supported features. But between these two, obviously there's tons of changes. But now we're getting more into the modern phone. With the iPhone 10, this is honestly one of the biggest changes ever within any iPhone. And when Apple dropped the iPhone 10, I was like, I don't understand how any of at that moment, I was thinking, how could this phone ever go down in the used market? That was like the first thing I was thinking. And now we're so used to seeing these things for like a few $100s. This was the first time we got a notch on these iPhones, and still, I would argue that the display on the iPhone 10 from 2017 still looks better than the display in some cases on the iPhone 14. That might be a stretch. Now, we still have, the sides that are still kind of the same. We still have, curved side on the iPhone 10, so not like a flat side, a lightning port. The build qualities are very similar. And every time I pick up my iPhone 14 and I do anything with it, I'm still so shocked about how similar my iPhone 10 is to my iPhone 14. It's super, super crazy. Now, we kind of have the top tier phones that I have up here that I've talked about for a long period of time. And honestly, I've kind of hit them over the head already like 20,000 times. We have the iPhone 10R. This was the base model of 2018, and I thought this was a really good iPhone as well. I was a massive fan of this device, and it was a budget-tier phone. We didn't have the IPS panel. We don't have the IPS panel anymore, but we had it back then, and I think some people weren't super happy with it, but it's totally okay. I wasn't really happy about it at all either, but that was $749. Then Apple dropped the iPhone 11, which I think was one of the most important things Apple's ever done. They dropped the price of these phones by a substantial amount, by $50 at the time, and these were $699. Now these ones are $799, so they have increased the price tag a little bit. We still have the same size display, still an IPS panel on this phone, but it was a fast phone, and we had 4 gigabytes of RAM on that device. Now with the iPhone 12 and iPhone 13, this is where things started getting way more interesting. So the iPhone 12 that came out in 2020, Apple did actually end up bringing the flat side back, which I think was a really big deal. And when I look at both these iPhones, there are so many similarities. You can tell like it's almost identically the same phone. Now on the back, that's probably where you can tell some of the most differences, I would say. You can see that the iPhone 14 pretty much had this like full-on, dual camera setup up and down. The 14s now had a diagonal, and I'll say the internal is pretty big difference. No, I wouldn't even say that because the iPhone 12 has, an A14 chip. The iPhone 14 has the A15 chip. So that's not even that big of a difference at that point. But then we look at something like the iPhone 13, which is the final iPhone, the 13 series. And I was also a humongous fan of the iPhone 13. That's honestly probably a better deal, like I mentioned before, than the iPhone 14. And I would probably recommend buying an iPhone 13 over the 14 in some cases if you can get it for a good price. Same kind of internals, you're getting better battery life on the 14, but I still think the iPhone 13 is a very good value per dollar. And overall, when I look at the bodies and everything, so much similarity overlapping, it's like not even funny at all. So that is kind of a quick history lesson of how all these iPhones kind of compare to the latest iPhone 14. I would love to hear your thoughts about this, so let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.